Hi, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Since this is a Friday morning, there are classes going on. I imagine people will be coming and going, so we're just going to start. So, friends, welcome. Our session entitled Christian Reflections on Holiness in Islam, Muslim Reflections on Holiness in Christianity. Our session this morning is predicated upon an idea that we've been working on a little bit at the Institute for Church Life, namely that admiration or appreciation can form a kind of pedagogy. The presentations in this panel will be what we could call appreciations, or even more strongly maybe statements of admiration, not so much theoretical expositions of religious ideas or doctrines, but rather stories or appreciations, as I'm calling them, which illustrate them in action, so to speak. Perhaps in our world we've become accustomed to thinking of the boundaries between cultures and religions as almost uncrossable, as separating realities that are so incommensurate with each other that a multicultural world would necessarily be a hopelessly fragmented world, or else one in which essential differences would be erased and relativized because they could not be understood. John Paul II, in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, reminded us, or reminded Catholics at any rate, that Christians were not alone in the ability to bear heroic witness to the good that is in human nature, and that in this we are accompanied by the witness of the great religious and sapiential traditions of the East and the West. The conviction here seems to be that goodness can be recognized wherever it is found, across cultural and religious barriers. We can all recognize and admire heroism in pursuit of the good, and this is, I think, what we're this morning calling holiness, when it is explicitly religiously inspired and construed. I think that John Paul II may have been saying that the admiration or appreciation we feel across cultural and religious boundaries may offer us a kind of pedagogy in interfaith understanding. The philosopher Gabriel Marcel once said, almost 50 years ago, that admiration was an act whose enormous spiritual and even metaphysical significance is still not recognized in belonging and disposability. Perhaps our panel this morning can be a step forward in this recognition. As we will see, we will include in our discussion not only persons but the texts that have inspired the persons, and we have tried to take as our experiment in interreligious understanding a course in which each panelist will present an appreciation of someone or something from the other tradition. And this is how we're going to work it, friends. We're going to have a panel of 5 presenters. We're going to go with 3 panelists, then a break, and then 2 panelists. And then we'll have discussion afterwards. And so I'm going to introduce very briefly the first 3 panelists, and then introduce the next 2. Just very brief introductions. Rashied Omar is faculty and fellow at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies right here at the University of Notre Dame. When he's not at the University of Notre Dame, he serves as imam at the Claremont Main Road Mosque in Cape Town, South Africa, and he's co-editor of the about-to-be-released Dictionary of Christian-Muslim Relations. That will be forthcoming from Cambridge University Press just this year, 2012. Gabriel Said Reynolds is the Tisch Family Associate Professor in the Department of Theology, also here at the University of Notre Dame, where he's also Director of Undergraduate Studies. He's the author of the forthcoming book, The Emergence of Islam, from Fortress Press in 2012, as well as the recently released New Perspectives on the Quran and its Historical Context from Routledge, 2011. Our third panelist this morning, Dr. Rasoulipour, is Visiting Research Fellow here in the Department of Theology and the Institute for Church Life, but full-time serves as Associate Professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Tarbiat in Tehran, where he teaches courses in philosophy of religion, mathematical logic, and Islamic philosophy. About to be released is his translation of Samuel Guttenplan's The Languages of Logic, which is translated from English into Farsi. So perhaps you'll join me in welcoming our panelists, and then we'll begin without interruption in between with Professor Omar.
Good morning. Good morning. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, mercy and blessings of God be upon you all. It might be expedient for me to begin by an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that something which is well known to all of us, but we need to make it all the time, that there is no one monolithic Islam. But in fact, there are a number of diverse understandings, articulations of Islam, frequently locked in a fierce rivalry, each one claiming to be the authentic, privileged, and orthodox voice of Islam. Now, this is not unique to Islam, but all of these polyphony of Muslim voices needs to be heard and engaged if we are indeed serious about interreligious dialogue. We cannot just choose some partners and leave out others. Of course, others are more difficult, but we need to try to engage all of these polyphony voices. In the aftermath of the war in Iraq, the world became all too familiar with the difference between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Now, as you know, the Sunni Muslims are the majority, but within Sunni Islam, there are currently, in contemporary times, two major theological tendencies vying for influence. One, a more traditional folk Islam, or Sufi or mystical tradition, which is deeply embedded in many cultural expressions of Islam across the globe. And in the last few decades, a so-called Salafi or Wahhabi orientation to Islam, which has been much in vogue in Saudi Arabia. The more mystical folk Islam would easily embrace the idea of holiness embodied in saints. The Salafi Wahhabi tradition would be more comfortable with seeking holiness in sacred texts. For purposes of representing both Muslim theological orientations, my paper reflects on and seeks inspiration and holiness within a Christian text. The idea of reading the sacred texts of religious traditions other than one's own is, of course, not a novel phenomenon. It has existed for a very long time. Regrettably, however, Christian and Muslim history is replete with endeavors aimed at rebutting, at refuting the authenticity and the integrity of each other's sacred texts. And one of the most well-known Muslim examples that comes to mind is that of the 11th century Spanish Muslim scholar called Abu Muhammad Ali ibn Hazm al-Zahiri al-Andalusi, who died in the year 1064. And we have esteemed Professor Ghulam Haydar Asi, who in fact did his Ph.D. on Ibn Hazm, so please correct me if I... Incidentally, in the Regensburg speech, Pope Benedict XVI invoked the theology of Ibn Hazm, which is very interesting. Ibn Hazm perhaps wrote one of the earliest systematic texts on comparative religion, a critique of the Old and the New Testaments. He has a 5-volume work called Al-Fisal fil Milal wal Ahwa wal Nihal, translated as an analysis of world religions, communities, ideologies, and sects. And he employed essentially what I believe to be a Muslim theology of revelation called Wahi, in order to prove that the Torah and the Gospels had been historically corrupted. We've heard tahrif yesterday. Ibn Hazm then is the progenitor of the Muslim doctrine of tahrif, the charge that Jews and Christians had corrupted their divinely revealed scriptures. You know, a doctrine which is very much in vogue in the Muslim mindset. Ibn Hazm's polemical style is unfortunately an abiding legacy that continues to bedevil Muslim relations with Christians and Jews, and in particular Muslim dispositions, Muslims' attitudes, and consequently their readings of the sacred texts of Jews and Christians. The fault line in Ibn Hazm's methodology was that, as I said, of employing a particularly Muslim discourse and theology of revelation and an exegetical tradition in order to read and critique the Old and the New Testaments. And the result of his flawed analysis was misunderstanding and irreverence. A more careful examination of the nature of different sacred texts, however, may suggest, I put it to you, that in fact Muslims, Jews, and Christians may operate with nuanced and different understandings of theologies of revelation. So the Muslim theology of revelation might be very different from Jewish and Christian theologies of revelation. And supporting such a view, one of the foremost contemporary Muslim scholars of Christianity, a man by the name of Mahmoud Ayyub, has argued that one may be able to differentiate between valid but distinct theologies or modes of revelation. The Bible, according to Ayyub, is more a revelation of action or a record of God's acting in the history of humankind. On the other hand, for Ayyub, the Quranic mode of revelation is more direct communication or commandment from God to human beings. Now, whether one accepts the veracity of Ayyub's depiction is not my point. I am essentially arguing that a deep sensitivity to and an appreciation of these differences in our theologies of revelation, it may enable us, it may assist us in building bridges of understanding between interfaith communities. In other words, to fairly interpret and to understand sacred texts of others, we have to hear them in the context of their theological paradigms in a process of mutual illumination. I would like to, maybe a friend of mine has put together most of his writings on Christianity, a very wonderful book by Mahmoud Ayyub, I think really pioneering Muslim view of Christianity. Ayyub makes a compelling case that in our troubled times, it demands that we base our arguments about other religious traditions upon sacred stories that are unambiguously healing, lifting them up so that they stand out as beacons of hope and transformation, exactly what this conference seeks to achieve. I would like to offer one such beacon of hope from the New Testament. And the passage I have chosen for reflection comes from the Epistle to the Hebrews, a passage that goes as follows, 13:2, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares," unquote. This passage is one of the many biblical texts that provide theological foundations for what has been described as the Christian doctrine of radical love of the other. As a Muslim scholar, I found myself instinctively drawn to begin with a linguistic analysis of this biblical text. And from the vantage point of semantics, it is striking to note that the Greek equivalent of the English entertain strangers is philoxenia. And the first element of the word philos, which refers to love or friendship, and thus the passage could simply mean hospitality. Philoxenia is, however, not a mere sentimental response to the other, but truly love for the stranger, as opposed to its antonym, which is xenophobia, which is well known to us. Hatred or fear of strangers. So philoxenia is exactly the opposite of xenophobia. And the Christian scriptural quotation that forms the basis of my reflections comes from the final chapter of the epistle. And this epistle is unique in the New Testament in that its literary genre is distinctively different from any of the other New Testament writings. Hebrews, it is widely recognized, is a sermon and more specifically a maw'idha, as we say in Arabic, an exhortation. In fact, this verse 2 forms part of a greater section from 13:1 to 17, and makes up the final exhortations of the epistle to living an authentic Christian life. And since the epistle's genre is a sermon, and a priestly sermon at that, the purpose and intention, I believe, of the author is principally to exhort, to strongly urge, to encourage his readers to live an authentic life, as of course is attested to by the witness of Jesus Christ. Verse 2 is part of a subsection 1 to 6 that deals with exhortations concerning community life, family life, and personal conduct. And the first two verses contain a double exhortation to brotherly conduct, namely brotherly love, Philadelphia, and hospitality, philoxenia. Now, aside from its occurrence here, philoxenia occurs 6 times in the New Testament. In contrast to its usage outside the early Christian literature, the word in the New Testament text is always used metaphorically for love towards brothers and sisters, not only brothers and sisters in the faith, but in fact everyone else. And this Greek usage is practically unknown during its time. So the biblical teaching is clear. Giving hospitality, loving kindness to strangers who are always to be seen as the children of God, even, I put to you, the presence of God. Strangers are to be seen as the presence of the God, with the consequence of blessing, establishes itself as a pattern early on in the Jewish tradition and hence in Christianity. I want to conclude because I don't want to take too much of your time, but it's also linked. In order to understand this text, you have to look at another text in which 3 people came to Abraham with Sarah, the story, and he offered them, they would bring glad tidings that he would beget a child, and he offered them some food. So from this passage we learn that Abraham, this great patriarchal prophet, may not have understood who the strangers are, but in the profoundest sense they represented the presence of God, and the consequence is a blessing for the barren Sarah and the child Isaac. The biblical teaching is clear. Giving hospitality and kindness to strangers are always, as I said, to be seen as something good and to be celebrated. I want to put it to you that a theologian has wisely said, and I quote, "We eat our religion." And that is in many ways literally and profoundly true. By eating together, sharing bread with each other. Often we think that interreligious dialogue is in these formal settings. I think the informal settings, where we eat together, we just interact as human beings, I think far more spiritual and far more profound than these formal dialogues. So I put it to you, by eating together, the truth of God's presence gets itself into us. It is an outward sign, at least, of the inward presence of God. The question then, can we, as Jews and Christians and Muslims, work together to recover this aspect of our traditions of feeding and of healing the world? I believe we can. This biblical teaching resonates with a Muslim teaching found in the Quranic concept of what I call ta'aruf, which means getting to know the other, or as I would like to interpret it very liberally, embracing the stranger as an extension of oneself. I want to conclude with this verse of the Quran, and I beg your indulgence as I recite it in Arabic. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhan nas, inna خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. صدق Allah. The translation goes as follows: O humankind, we have created you of a male and a female and fashioned you into nations and tribes so that you may come to know each other, recognize each other, not despise each other. Surely the most honorable of you with God is those with the best conduct, with the best piety. Lo, God is all-knowing, all-aware. This verse of the Quran enjoins human beings to celebrate gender, cultural and national diversity through ta'aruf, recognition and affirmation of each other through intimate knowledge and not mere toleration. Through this verse, the Quran teaches that differences among humankind are not incidental and negative, but rather it represents a God-willed basic factor of human existence. The Quranic concept of ta'aruf is an alternative vision to that of xenophobia and represents one of the basic and core teachings of Islam. It should be clear then that all of our sacred texts celebrate the concept of hospitality and consequently endorses the practice of welcoming the stranger into our midst. The challenge facing Christians and Muslims is to liberate themselves from narrow conceptions through which they define themselves as communities of privilege and exclusion. In my view, the litmus test for so-called good or bad religion is the extent to which we are willing to embrace the other, whoever the other may be, as an extension of ourselves. We need to recognize our common humanity and see others as a reflection of ourselves. If we do not try to know the other, how can we ever know the divine? Thank you for your patience.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gabriel. I'd like to begin by thanking a couple of people. Actually, first I'd like to begin by thanking the Institute for Church Life generally, or publicly expressing my admiration for the Institute for Church Life, which has been a remarkable presence at Notre Dame. On the one hand, because of the events that it has sponsored, unprecedented gatherings at Notre Dame. You may know earlier this semester there was a conference on stories of practical holiness, which in fact was a remarkable occasion on which this idea of a pedagogy of admiring holiness in the other was demonstrated with lectures from religious leaders from throughout the world. More recently, there was a conference on the Theology of Pope Benedict called God is Love. And then there's the present conference, which I'm honored to be a part of. I'd like to thank John Cavadini, the director of the Institute for Church Life, who's organized all of these things, but also the people who have been working for this particular conference, Jenny Monahan and Jim Lee. Also the chair of the... I'm almost done. Also the chair of the Theology department, who's been supportive as well, Matt Ashley. And then finally to thank the speakers last night who showed not only wisdom but graciousness. And in addition to their words, their conduct that they set for us, I think, was inspiring. So Father Samir and Dr. Gavahi. And then I'd also like to thank Dr. Rashied Omar for his presentation. Even though the problem was his presentation was so good that in comparison this will seem relatively mediocre, I think. I'd like to speak this morning about a medieval Muslim figure by the name of Taqi ad-Din Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah. In fact, I'd like to present something like a Catholic appreciation of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah came from the city of Haran, like Abraham. But he lived most of his life in Cairo and especially Damascus in the end of his life, where he was the most prominent religious figure of his day, and he died there in Damascus in prison in 1328. Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the most prolific authors in Islamic history. The printed edition, most recent printed edition of his collected fatwas, or juridical opinions, is in 36 volumes, which, as a rule, is an amount hardly rivaled, except by Father Samir and Dr. Gavahi. To those who have never heard before of Ibn Taymiyyah, or rather, to those who know something of his reputation in the modern age, this may seem an unusual choice for this sort of event, which is dedicated to the admiration of the religious other. Ibn Taymiyyah, in fact, is often thought of, as one modern Muslim scholar puts it, as, quote, the ultimate troublemaker. Another contemporary scholar, Majid Fakhri, accuses Ibn Taymiyyah of slavish traditionalism, anti-rationalist polemics, and I hadn't heard of this word before, misology, the hatred of reason. To some, Ibn Taymiyyah is the father of Islamism or Salafism or Wahhabism, we've got lots of names for this now, or Muslim fundamentalism. A recent book on modern Islamic fundamentalism entitled The Age of Sacred Terror addresses the recent history of extremism in Sunni Islam in a chapter entitled Ibn Taymiyyah and His Children. In other words, Ibn Taymiyyah's reputation, in the West at least, is not that of a saint, but rather as something like the father of Sunni extremism. And so I might begin this talk by explaining why I've chosen to speak about Ibn Taymiyyah. And I'd like to offer 3 reasons. First, and most importantly, I believe, and in this regard my belief has been influenced substantially by the writings of Pope Benedict, that Christians, and maybe Catholics in particular, should have a particular ability to understand with sympathy the religious teachings of Muslims. And it seems to me, in addition, important that this sympathetic understanding not be limited to those Muslims who are somehow recognizable to Christians, perhaps because they emphasize the mystical traditions of Islam, or perhaps because they made explicit gestures to find common ground with Christians, but rather this sort of sympathetic understanding should extend to all Muslims. Second, so the second reason why I'm speaking about Ibn Taymiyyah suffered for his religious convictions. I've already alluded to the end of his life, which was spent in prison. I'll speak a bit more about that later. This sort of suffering for religious conviction, it seems to me, is itself a mark of a sincere believer, sincerity in religious belief, and therefore is rightly admired. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells his followers, "Blessed are you when people abuse you and persecute you and speak all kinds of calumny against you falsely on my account." Ibn Taymiyyah was indeed abused and persecuted and accused of all sorts of things. Some of them may have been true. Whether this makes him blessed or not, I don't know, and in fact, I don't think that I have the right to judge. But as a Christian, as a believer in a Savior who willingly took up his cross to suffer for us, and as a Catholic, a member of a church which has always looked with a special love on the sacrifice of the martyrs, I can't help but admire Ibn Taymiyyah for the sake of that suffering. Third and finally, third reason for speaking about Ibn Taymiyyah, his religious teaching is actually filled with intriguing surprises, and is one such surprise that I will focus on today. In fact, I would submit that the closer one looks at Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching, the more one begins to believe that Ibn Taymiyyah is not at all the father of Islamic fundamentalism. That the father of Islamic fundamentalism or Salafism is an Ibn Taymiyyah who exists only in the dreams of Muslim fundamentalists. The author of a May 22, 2003 editorial in a Saudi newspaper, which was published 10 days after a bombing, very destructive bombing in the Saudi capital of Riyadh, he declared, quote, "Let us say honestly, our problem today is with Ibn Taymiyyah himself." Now, the perpetrators of that bombing in 2003 quoted a fatwa from Ibn Taymiyyah to justify their attack. But this hardly means that they did so properly. Indeed, I'd like to submit this morning that a faithful reading of Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching will suggest that what is ultimately distinctive of Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching is not any one particular doctrine, not the content of any one particular doctrine, or the ruling of any one particular juridical opinion or fatwa, whether in regard to Christians or non-Muslims or otherwise. What is distinctive is instead the method by which he developed doctrine. And it is on this point of Ibn Taymiyyah, that is his method, that I will begin. True to his Sunni heritage, Ibn Taymiyyah teaches that Muslims have access to two sources of divine revelation. The first, the Quran, the very word of God brought down from heaven. And the second, the Sunnah, the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, who was infallible, never committed or never spoke anything untrue, and impeccable, never did anything sinful or erroneous, and therefore is a model to be imitated in everything he said and did. And this second source of revelation is accessible, according to Sunni Muslims, in certain collections of, particular collections of reports about the Prophet known as hadith. To Ibn Taymiyyah, these two sources of revelation are both perfectly authoritative, being as they are reflections of God's will, and infinitely more reliable than human reason, being as it is human. It's true, of course, that according to Ibn Taymiyyah and all Muslims, only the Quran has a liturgical function. That is, only the Quran should be recited in prayer or be the source of pious reading. But nevertheless, Quran and Hadith, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, have equal authority in instructing Muslims on how to practice Islam. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah came from a particular tradition of Sunni Islam known as Hanbali Islam, one of the four surviving canonical legal schools in Sunni Islam. And in Hanbali Islam generally, although there's quite some diversity within this one tradition, the importance of guarding the Islamic community's fidelity to the Sunnah or the model of the Prophet Muhammad is emphasized. By a Hanbali way of thinking, the Islamic community is threatened in every age by those who would veer from the example of the Prophet, by wrongly inserting deviant, innovative doctrines or practices. This way of thinking can make Hanbali seem rather boorish to some modern observers, for which reason some of them refer to them as the Puritans of Islam. I don't know if that's meant to cast a negative light on Puritans or Hanbalis or both. It would be wrong, though, to think that Ibn Taymiyyah's thinking in this regard is somehow primitive. In this regard, I mean the authoritative nature of these two sources of revelation. Or to think that Ibn Taymiyyah would say that Muslims are not called to be rationalists or not called to think carefully about their religion. In fact, in some ways, Ibn Taymiyyah is a perfect rationalist. In fact, he argues that the authority of these two sources of revelation is itself proven by reason. It is because of that status, their validity proven by rational means, that they're authoritative. In a work known as, the English translation, Removing the Contradiction Between the Intellect and Revelation, he writes, to give priority to reason is impossible. Why? Because it is reason which has proved the truth of Scripture and the necessity of accepting what the Messenger of God, Muhammad, has related. Were we to deny Scripture, we would thereby deny the evidence of reason. It would also be wrong to think that Ibn Taymiyyah is necessarily committed to some sort of pugnacious interpretation of Islam. Instead, it's a certain method he's committed to. And this method, I would say, should not be foreign to Catholics, who hold that sacred tradition, in addition to sacred scripture, has authority, and that the magisterium is a proper interpreter of that tradition. In fact, in some ways, Ibn Taymiyyah's concern with innovative practices or doctrines in Islam might be useful to Catholics today who are concerned with similar sorts of deviant innovations. I, for one, wouldn't mind delivering some fatwas. But in any case, the point is one of method. It is true at times that the method of Ibn Taymiyyah leads him to certain positions which are pugnacious, that lead to fatwas against Christians or Shiites or Sunni Muslim mystics or philosophers, but at other times it leads him to positions which are the contrary, are ironic. This is seen, for example, in what he says about hellfire, and that's the surprising example I'd like to present today. Some background on this point might be useful. The Quran in several passages speaks of those who are in hellfire as abiding in it eternally. خَالِدُونَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا. Elsewhere, however, the Quran has some suggestion, it seems, that they may not be eternally in hellfire. The damned may have some respite, ultimately, from hellfire. We find, for example, in Quran 11:107, Surah Hud, where the Quran tells us that as so long as the heavens and earth abides, I begin with the previous verse, wherein the damned, the wretched will be in the fire, wherein there will be moaning and sighing, therein dwelling forever. خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا مَا دَامَتْ السَّمَوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ. So long as the heavens and earth abide. But in this verse, we have a new phrase, which is, save as thy Lord will. إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ رَبُّكَ. This addition suggests that maybe there will be some period where God will no longer will for them to remain eternally in hellfire. There's some other similar examples, but I'll just mention one other Quranic verse, which is Surah 78, verse 23. The larger passage is important. Behold, hell has become an ambush for the insolent, a resort, therein to tarry for ages. لَابِثِينَ فِيهَا أَحْقَابًا. And to many interpreters, this reference of being there for ages, ahqaban, suggests that an age necessarily is a finite period of time. Therefore, the damned will have a reprieve from hell. Sunni Islam generally, the majority opinion, and indeed you can find some debate about this on in contemporary Muslim literature and online, but the general standard position is indeed those who are damned to hell remain there forever. For his part, Ibn Taymiyyah has one fatwa which was published earlier in his life, which is found in his great collection and some other works like Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyya, in which he condemns the idea that hellfire will come to an end. He says the people of the Sunnah, the Sunnis, are agreed that there are some things from creation that will not come to an end, such as paradise and hellfire. But we find a remarkable report, and this is my concluding reflection, so I'm almost done. A remarkable report that suggests that towards the end of his life, Ibn Taymiyyah developed a different doctrine on this point. And the report is related by his most famous disciple, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah, who dies in 1350. And he reports a story that towards the end of Ibn Taymiyyah's life, when Ibn Taymiyyah was in prison, he visited Ibn Taymiyyah to ask him a question about a hadith that he had found. It's not a prophetic hadith, it's a hadith about the second caliph, Omar ibn al-Khattab. The disciple of Ibn Taymiyyah remembers, I had asked Shaykh al-Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, about the everlasting nature of hellfire. He said to me, this issue is very great, and he gave no reply. Some time had passed after that when I saw in the commentary of another Muslim scholar a tradition that I had mentioned. I'll explain this tradition in a moment. So then I sent the book to Ibn Taymiyyah when he was in his last session, fi majlisihi al-akhir. I marked the place in the book. We imagine he actually, I don't know if he folded the page or did he put a sticky note, whatever. And I told the messenger, apparently he was no longer able to visit him in prison. I told the messenger, say to him, this place is difficult. He does not know what it is. And then Ibn Taymiyyah wrote his famous work about it. May the mercy of God be upon him. Let me explain the tradition and the famous work. Then I'll be my concluding note. The traditions to which Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah refers here are connected to a report according to which the second companion, the second caliph, declared, even if the people of the fire stayed in the fire like the amount of sand of Alij, they would have, despite that, a day in which they would come out. Does that make sense? So even if we can imagine every grain of sand was 1 day or 1 year, and there was as much sand as there is in Alij, and you can guess, Alij is a place in the Arabian Peninsula, a sandy desert, eventually they will come out of hellfire. So we have two pieces of information from the two sources of revelation. on the one hand, suggestions in the Quran that the damned might have a reprieve and leave hellfire, and then a report from one of the pious forebearers who preserves somehow in his own statements the example of the Prophet Muhammad, according to which the damned definitely will come out of hellfire. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, this is not something to be taken lightly. This is a report from the two authoritative sources of revelation. In fact, in recent years, we have learned exactly what the famous work that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya refers to without naming is. It's a work known today, although whether it was its original title is not clear, but known as Fana an-Nar, or the extinction or annihilation of hellfire. And what makes it intriguing is it seems indeed to have been the last work that Ibn Taymiyyah wrote in his life. That he wrote it indeed from prison. And that's suggested by this reference when he says, في مجلسه الأخير, in the last session. Indeed, it's worth emphasizing that Ibn Taymiyyah had a life of suffering for the last 20 years. He was imprisoned in 1306 in Cairo, again in 1308 in Cairo, 1309 in prison in Alexandria. At least he was in a new city. He went to Damascus when there was a change in the ruling party of the city, but again in 1321 he was in prison. He was relieved after 5 months in Damascus, and then in 1326 he was imprisoned in the citadel of Damascus, and he was officially banned from issuing any fatwas, and yet he continued to do so. And things got so bad that about a year into this final imprisonment, the ruler of the city delivered orders to the prison guards that any traces of paper and writing instruments be removed from his cell. I imagine he continued to write fatwas on the wall with chalk or something. Indeed, he died in prison in 1328. I want to condense here because I think I might be taking time from our fellow speakers. Well, so the final teaching of Ibn Taymiyyah, in other words, written from prison, is that all those condemned to hell. And there was some question among earlier Muslim interpreters. Some would suggest that, well, some people might get a reprieve from hell, and there's a famous tradition about where those condemned to hell will try to walk across a famous bridge that's above the fires of hell, and the damned won't be able to make it, so they'll fall in. But the angels will recognize the Muslims among the damned because they'll have the prayer mark that comes from prostrations, and they have hooks, and they'll bring out the Muslims, but the non-Muslims, they'll remain there. But Muslims eventually will be saved from hellfire. This is not Ibn Taymiyyah's conclusion. Ibn Taymiyyah's conclusion is emphatically in this work on the annihilation of fire that all people will eventually have a reprieve from hell and be granted admission into paradise. Whether they're Muslims, Jews, Christians, philosophers, atheists. At the same time, Ibn Taymiyyah insists, and this is equally important, that if hell will be extinguished, paradise will not. Paradise too, like hell, was created by God, but it will not be extinguished. Why? Because the revelation itself suggests to a faithful, pious reader that paradise is fundamentally consistent with the divine qualities. And in this regard, in the same treatise, he quotes verses from the Quran which speak about that God has decreed for himself mercy. And he mentions that at the beginning of all but one chapter of the Quran, they begin with the invocation of God's mercy, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And in the hadith too, he notes, we find hadith in which God in fact is quoted as saying, my mercy precedes my anger. My mercy overcomes my anger. So final note. The conclusion seems, this conclusion about the salvation of all damned to hell seems to mark a distinctive development in Ibn Taymiyyah's doctrine. Remember, in an earlier work, he seems to have concluded otherwise. Now, it seems to me that Ibn Taymiyyah's development in doctrine probably was not prompted by a love of sinners or heretics or unbelievers, but it was prompted by his method, according to which both sources of revelation have authority, whether they lead you to pugnacious or irenic doctrines. But we might also remember that Ibn Taymiyyah developed this teaching while he was in prison, after having suffered for 20 years by the hands of Muslim rulers who persecuted him. He might have felt tempted to ignore the suggestions of God's mercy in the source of revelation and develop instead a more rigorous eschatology, less generous eschatology. Imagine him sitting in the jail cell in Damascus, fantasizing about the eternal punishment of the one who put him there. He doesn't do that. He doesn't give in to this temptation. Instead, he chose to remain faithful to his method. And that faithfulness, I believe, is worthy of admiration. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. First of all, let me thank John Cavadini and his institute. I have heard since 2007 that I have been coming to Notre Dame University from many colleagues and friends that Notre Dame has some sense, and one of them is John Cavadini. If he's not the only. Thank you so much for his and his friends' support. And instead of talking about any good figure of Christian side for interreligious living and dialogue, I can say that my living during these years coming to Notre Dame with Theology department friends and Institute for Church Life friends was a good model of living peacefully, mutual respect, and understanding each other, not just by arguing, not just by discussion, that we, as I remember, I never had this type of argument and discussion with John Cavadini and his friends, but by living, eating, as my friend mentioned, sitting with each other and talking with each other, drinking coffee with each other. So I think the best solution for having good relationship with each other is living with each other. So that's why during 3 years that I was in charge of a center for interreligious dialogue in Tehran, the most successful dialogues that we had in Tehran was dialogues not among theologians, philosophers, but mystics, the people who came to Tehran, or we take them to other countries to live with each other and to talk not about their labels, their sects, their schools, their books, but talking about mercy, love, that all belongs to God. So in mystical level dialogue, we are talking about God, not about ourselves. So I can say that the successful dialogue that I have experienced during my vocation and job was dialogue among mystics. We call them Arif in Arabic language or Farsi language. So that's why I prefer to talk in this session about Saint Francis, that is famous not for being a theologian or a philosopher, a thinker, but a mystic. And as he said, we illiterate subject ourselves to all. So he's proud to call himself, I'm illiterate. Just different from the other philosophers and thinkers that are showing their presence, their knowledge, their books, and their labels. Okay, I'm not here to talk about Saint Francis of Assisi, God grace given to him. I'm not talking about his dreams and his spiritual experience. For example, in 1206 in San Damiano, or in 1224 in Alverna in Italy. And I'm not talking about his experience of stigmata, that it was very impressive for me to learn more about this experience in future in Christianity. And I'm not talking about his experience living with poor people in poverty, but I'm trying to just record his experience living among Muslims. During the Crusade Fifth, he had chance to go to Egyptian king, Sultan Al-Kamil, and when I was reading the story, I preferred to choose this title, The Hunter Who Was Hunted, because as the records, he went to Egyptian king to convert him to Islam. And he wanted to show himself, maybe. He wanted to show his book. He wanted to show his God, his Lord. But he was hunted by his Lord. He went there to show him himself, but he saw some realities among Muslim community. So we have a Kantian term, a posteriori and a priori knowledge. And so instead of having a priori knowledge, judging people before living with them and experiencing them and seeing them, having a posteriori knowledge. And after being with them, talking about them. And this is the story of Saint Francis that I wanted to talk about more today. In 1219, accompanied by another friar and hoping to convert the Sultan of Egypt or win martyrdom in the attempt, Francis went to Egypt, where a Crusader army had been encamped for over a year, besieging the walled city of Damietta, 2 miles upstream from the mouth of one of the main channels of the Nile. The Sultan al-Kamil, a nephew of Salahuddin Ayyub, had succeeded his father as Sultan of Egypt in 1218 and was encamped upstream of Damietta, unable to relieve it. A bloody of futile attack on the city was launched by the Christians on 29 August 1219, following which both sides agreed to ceasefire, which lasted 4 weeks. It was most probably during this interlude that Francis and his companion crossed the Muslim lines and were brought before the Sultan, remaining in his camp for a few days. The visit is reported in contemporary Crusader sources and in the earliest biographies of Francis, but they give no information about what transpired during the encounter beyond noting that the Sultan received Francis graciously, and that Francis preached to Muslim without effect, returning unharmed to the Crusader camp. No contemporary Arab source mentions the visit. One detail added by Saint Bonaventure, in the official life of Francis, written 40 years after the event, concerns an alleged challenge by Francis offering trial by fire in order to prove the veracity of the Christian gospel. Although Bonaventure does not suggest as much, subsequent biographies went further, claiming that a fire was kindled, which Francis was successful to come out from the fire without any injury and pain. According to some late sources, the Sultan gave Francis permission to visit the Muslim places, sacred places in Holy Land, and even to preach there, all that can safely be asserted in that Francis and his companion left the Crusader camp for Acre. After his experience of visiting Holy Land, having permission to preach there among Muslims, he came back, and in 1221 he wrote a regulation called the Regula non Bullata. The attitude of Francis of Assisi toward the Muslim provides a model for Christian-Muslim relations and for interreligious dialogue in general that is highly relevant today. The late 12th and early 13th century European context of discussion of Islam and Crusade movement, quoting from documents and encyclicals by Innocent III, Honorius III, and Gregory IX, and writings by Crusade preachers like James of Vitry, Francis' rule as Regula non Bullata of 1221 call his brothers who go among the Muslims must live among them and be subject to them. Being subject to them. The notion of being subject precludes aggressive efforts at conversion, evangelizing, and proselytizing, and makes matter of dogma secondary to sharing the lives of these other believers that my friend Rashied mentioned. I have been very much touched and impressed by the story of Abraham's tent in Old Testament. Genesis chapter 18. The whole chapter is talking about this story of strangers, others, that finally they are holy. Finally they are sacred. So that's why I asked my students last year to work on a collaboration project on sacredness of other. And I believe in that the other is God. So other is holy. A book written by Huberichts, a German that I try to make a good pronunciation of his name. I hope that it is right. Huberichts. I tried several times. Okay, in his Francis and Islam, published in English version, English language in 1997, says, when during his, means Francis, stay among the Muslims, he experienced how God had graciously accepted them in the otherness of their religion and culture and blessed them with good gifts. He knew that he too had to accept the Muslim in their otherness and approach them with respect of God's sake. It is this respect for the other believers in their otherness which Francis asks from his brothers today. To this end, the brothers must develop in themselves a great sensitivity for the good that God works in the people of other faiths. The idea that God works among persons of other faiths in ways that demand respect for Christians is a common theme in contemporary writing on interreligious dialogue. Everett Cousins, for example, has written in his book Christ of the 21st Century, published in 1992, he says, the experience of God's transcendence is central to Islam. It is what we, in passing over, must contact as the primary element of the Islamic religious consciousness. Our method must be that of passing over rather than mere analogy to Christian experience of God's transcendence. It was made by Francis and his brothers in reply to the call of Innocent III on April 19, 1213, to hold a council with the twofold purpose of reconquering the Holy Land and reforming the Universal Church. They let themselves be guided by questions which arose from their contact with reality, living with Muslims. In other words, Francis and his brothers approached their problems a posteriori on the basis of their own experience. While Innocent III called for recapture of Jerusalem and Holy Land by fire and sword, the Fifth Crusade, upon which he had decided by divine inspiration in order to vindicate the injury done to the crucified, Francis and his brothers were convinced that the use of arms and violence could not be reconciled with their way of life as lesser brothers and as Christians. For Jesus had revealed to them that they should greet the people by saying, "May the Lord give you peace." Thus Francis occupied an exceptional position among his commentators with contemporaries with regard to the Crusades and the attitude they expressed towards the Muslim and Islam. This is all the more striking since virtually the entire church from high to low was committed to the crusade. Because in that time they were saying that Muhammad is a pseudo-prophet. Muhammad is seduced people according to revelation of St. John, and his number of Muhammad followers now will be end within 666 years, and now 600 passed, just we have 66 years to finish this religion. The mission chapter of Regula Non-Bulata was done after Francis' stay in Egypt. Francis' concrete experience during his stay among the Muslims offered the best explanation for chapter 16, certainly for the part 1 to 9, which is explicitly concerned with the brothers who go among Muslims. I just wanted to mention to chapter 9 before going to chapter 16 some very beautiful words we have here in chapter 9 as well. He says that the friars are not to blaspheme nor detract, but are to love one another. Let all the friars beware of themselves, so that they do not calumniate others, nor contend with words. On the contrary, let them strive to keep silence. We have also in our holy book in Quran, whenever somebody blaspheme you or saying something that despising you, just say salam, just say peace. So this is the same strategy, same actually reaction by true Christians, by Saint Francis and his lesser brothers. Not let them quarrel among themselves, nor with others, but let them take care to humbly respond, saying, I am a useless servant. And let them not grow angry, because everyone who grows angry with his brother shall be answerable them not to grow to judgment. And let them love one another, just as the Lord says, this is my precept, that you love each other, just as I have loved you. Okay, very beautiful words. Because of the time, I cannot continue all of them. But let's go to the final point, the target, chapter 16. On traveling among Muslims and other infidels. What's his suggestion? He says, "Whence let whatever friar who wants to go among the Muslim and other infidels go in accord with permission of his minister." Okay, after just these formalities, he comes to this. Indeed, the friars who go can conduct themselves spiritually among them in two manners. The first manner, that they cause no arguments, nor strife, but be subject to every human creature for God's sake. I will come to these words, more explanation. And confess themselves to be Christians. The other manner is that when they have seen that it pleases God, they announce the word of God, so that they may believe in God, the Omnipotent, Father and Son and Holy Spirit, the Creator of all things, in the Redeemer and Savior, the Son, Jesus Christ. Okay, living spiritually among them. The brothers who go can live spiritually among them in two ways. Through a short but well-chosen expression within the broader context of the way they saw their presence in the world, just as was the case with the world in general, so must the brothers see their presence in the world of the Muslim as a spiritual presence, as a presence, therefore, in the spirit of the Lord. So they went without possession and arms in order to bring peace to everyone whom they met on their way. Also, their strategy was everywhere the same: to share their life and work of the people, to eat and drink with them whatever the table offered, and so in mutual solidarity to give concrete shape to God's original plan of creation. The other word, not to engage in argument or disputes. For confronted with the it was actually a strategy of Christians that time, because they believed that Muhammad was liar, so they were trying to argue that we are right and you are wrong, and Muhammad was liar. So in that atmosphere, Francis calls and invites his brothers not to engage in argument or dispute. Francis and his brothers chose different strategy. He was not so much influenced by desire for practical success to convert people and show that the statistics that, okay, in this country we were successful to convert people from Islam or from Buddhism, from Hinduism to Christianity. He was not at all influenced by the desire for practical success. Rather, he was profoundly concerned with translating all that he had come to know as the truth about God and about Jesus Christ during his stay among Muslims. He was not living among labeled Muslim. He was living among creatures of God, God's servants, among human beings, among his brothers. He was not saying others, strangers. He was saying his Lord among them. because we believe that we all are signs of God. So if you can see God through river, mountain, why you cannot see God through Muslims, your brothers? Okay. It was for God's sake that brothers must not engage in arguments and disputes with the Muslim. For God is according to very personal expression of Francis' humility, and God wants the brothers to imitate this humility in their lives. This is why brothers must not exercise power over others, nor pride themselves about others, nor feel themselves superior to others. On the contrary, they were to be lesser brothers, who in humble service wash one another's feet. The last part, subject to every human creature. The word of subditus, or subject, or submissive, can be called a key word of the spiritual of Francis and his brothers. He says, we were illiterate and subject to all. And he assured all those who were subject to every human creature for God's sake that the Spirit of the Lord would rest upon them and be at home among them. They would again give birth to Jesus. Giving birth to Jesus. They would give him a new historical existence in this world by the works they would do in the strength of the Spirit, especially by establishing true peace. Okay. Thanks to his openness, Francis was able to see with his own eyes the deep religiosity of the Muslim and to admire it. He was struck by the great reverence they had for their holy book, the Quran. He was also struck by the daily public calls to prayer, to the praise of the all-powerful God. The Muslims were believing, praying people, whatever others may have said about them. Thank you.
Friends, our schedule calls now for the remaining 2 panel presentations, and then we'll have a period for question and answer. So, just very brief introductions of our final 2 panelists. First, Mehdi Azaiez is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Provence. His dissertation on polemic and the Quran is about to be submitted. But meanwhile, when he wasn't working on his dissertation, he is co-editor of the forthcoming Les études coraniques aujourd'hui, méthode, enjeu, débat. So, Quranic studies today. Mehdi will be a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Institute for Church Life in the coming academic year. And last but not least, Lawrence Sullivan, professor of world religions and the Department of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame, also concurrent professor of anthropology. He now also serves as the president and CEO of the Fetzer Institute, dedicated to the furtherance and propagation of love and forgiveness in the emerging global community of today. So maybe we could welcome both of our panelists at once, and Mehdi will come up.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm a bad student. I will propose a presentation very short and very descriptive, but I hope it will be a success for me. I would like, first of all, to say that it's a great honor to be here at Notre Dame. It's a really beautiful university. We don't have the same in France, unfortunately. I would like to thank Joan Cavadini and my dear friend Gabriel Reynolds from the Institute for Search Life for their invitation. Thank you very much.
A little louder, please.
Ah, yeah. Before I talk about Christian de Chergé, the subject of my short lecture, I would like to share with you a memory that will explain this choice and my general concern. It was on May 28th, 1996. I remember a crowd of 10,000 people gathered in a place dedicated to the human rights called Le Parvis des Droits de l'Homme. It's a beautiful and famous place facing the Eiffel Tower. Here, at the end of the afternoon, was given a tribute to the 7 monks of Tiberine. A few days before, the world knew they have been assassinated. For their memory, Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, known and for the most of them unknown person like me, were all together as one to salute those men of peace. During the ceremony, I don't really remember what has been said in the different speeches, but I remember clearly a book of condolences where we were invited to write something. Don't ask me what I wrote, it's impossible to remember, but your invitation here in this beautiful place in Notre Dame gave me like a surprising and new occasion to remind them. But what speak about them today, and Christian de Chergé particularly? In some way, it can be considered as a paradoxical choice. Maybe for many people, their tragic death was an obvious sign of an impossible dialogue between Christians and Muslims. In fact, how could those whose was life devoted and dedicated to interfaith dialogue have been victims of this awful crime? But in the same time, we can also ask another question which turns on this first question. Did this crime reveal, on the contrary, the obvious intention for the terrorists to kill this possibility of dialogue? Because it was working. In this case, and it's my conviction, isn't our duty to pursue the work of the monk as an expression of our gratitude for them, and by this way keep their memory and commitment alive? But what was this message they left to us? What can we learn from those men who put the dialogue as their central token of their own engagement as Christians? What can Muslims and Christians learn from their experience? Maybe the best way to reply to those questions is to introduce modestly and surely too shortly the well-known figure Christian de Chergé, the prior of the community of Tiberine. His life, his works and deeds illustrate in the better way what we can call the interreligious experience of Tiberine. For that purpose, I will proceed in 3 stops. First, I would like to present briefly the biography of Christian de Chergé. It will be the occasion to introduce an idea. One of the main features of Christian de Chergé's theology of interreligious dialogue is rooted in the lived experience of life among Muslims in Algeria. In a second step, I will make a presentation of the chapters he wrote between 1986 to 1996. The second step will be the occasion to understand how his theology of dialogue is rooted in the Catholic tradition. At least in the third step, based on those chapters and other writings, I will try to explore briefly the meaning of dialogue for Christian de Chergé. I can't finish this introduction without explaining my gratitude to my dear friend, Father Christian Salençon, who is one of the best specialists of Christian de Chergé thoughts today. He's the person who introduced me to this remarkable theology of hope, and many things you will hear from me today come from my reading of his books. So I will begin this first part by a short biography of Christian de Chergé. It will be the occasion to understand how his theology of dialogue is rooted in a personal life. Charles-Marie Christian de Chergé was born on January 18, 1937, in Colmar. It's a small town near the border of Germany, in France. He was the son of a military officer descended from an aristocratic family with a long military history. During his childhood, he spent 3 years, between 1942 to 1945, with his family in the capital of Algeria, following his father, who was a regiment commander. His brother described this period as an illuminated year, learning respect and curiosity for the Muslim faith. Moving back to France, the child grew up in Paris in different Catholic institutions. In 1959, he was 23. He left the seminary and returned in Algeria as an officer. Here he met Muhammad, who became quickly a good friend. One day, this man, a Muslim, a father of 10 children, a farmer, died to save his life. Christian de Chergé will never forget it. In some way, it's maybe the turning point of his life, and Christian expressed it explicitly in one of his writings. A few years later, after the Algerian War, he was ordained to the priesthood in Paris in March 21, 1964. He left the diocesan clergy 5 years later to become a Trappist in Algeria. He entered the monastery of Atlas on August 1969. He made his novitiate at Ekbel, and before his solemn profession at Atlas on October 1976, he spent 2 years at Rome studying Arabic and the Quran. In 1984, he was elected titular prior of Atlas. At Tiberine, his monastic life was deeply and continually inspired by contact with the Muslim population. On many occasions, prayers in common were regularly possible. A group composed by Muslims and Christians began to meet regularly at Tiberine for prayer and dialogue. In 1991, the Algerian Civil War began. It was 10 years, called the Dark Decade, of a succession of atrocity, produced perhaps 100,000 victims, mostly among the civilian population. It was this context that he lived his final years. But despite of the danger, and to express their solidarity with their Muslim brothers and sisters, Christian de Chergé and all the community of Tiberine decided to stay in Algeria. This decision was taken with serenity as a consequence of their commitment and their fidelity to the name of the Christ. During the night of March 27-28, 1996, the 7 monks were abducted by Islamic fundamentalists. Their kidnapping was claimed by a radical faction of JIA, Groupe Islamique Armé. In May 23, the JIA announced that the monks had been executed on May 21, 1996. They were buried in the cemetery of their monastery at Tiberine on June. 3 facts can be underlined in this short biography. 1, the presence of Algeria and Islam began very soon and had never stopped in his life. Second, this story of love with this country is also marked by two tragedies for him and Algerians, two wars. His life, three. His life as a monk dedicated to the Christ was always in connection with the people of Algeria and the commitment of dialogue, which was for him a theological necessity. This is this last point I would like to explore and ask, what was the conception of dialogue for Christian de Chergé? To answer to this question, we have to read mainly his 605 chapters he wrote for his community, but also a few lectures he made during few travels in Europe and later sent to his family. For that purpose, in the following second part, I would like to shortly again to introduce this huge corpus. I'll focus particularly on his chapters. Christian de Chergé's thoughts are particularly known from the chapters he wrote between 1984 and 1996. As you know, the term chapters comes from the Latin capitulum, or chapter, which here means an essential part of writing. As part of the life of monks, these chapters are oral teachings given by the prior to his brothers. These teachings were given 3 mornings a week during the celebration of the office of terce, around 9 in the morning. According to the monastic rule of the order of Cistercian of the strict observance, the teacher of the school of Christ, the father ensures the loyalty of followers to the monastic tradition as he fits them by the word of God, but also by his own example. In the days appointed, the priest speaks to the whole community and he comments frequently on the rules of Saint Benedict. More precisely, we possess 605 chapters published in a book titled God for Every Day, translation of Dieu pour toujours, expression from Christian de Chergé himself. Those texts treat various topics about catechism and liturgy, psalm, songs, notions of humility and conversion, communities of the Middle East, rule of the Saint Benedict himself, the new constitution of the order, the church in the world, and finally the charisma of martyrdom. We can summarize those topics in 5 thematics, which are reflection on ecclesial and liturgical matters, scriptural reading and commentary of Bible, moral reflection on the community life and rules, and finally, at the end, the martyrdom. It's not a surprise that notion of the martyr took a large part of his thoughts in the end of his life. In these rich materials, we realize how much those attempts are rooted in the Christian and Catholic tradition. But we note where Islam and Quran are often quoted. In many ways, those texts revealed an original thoughts of dialogue. Among this richness, I would like to insist introducing only 2 points. For Christian de Chergé, dialogue is existential and spiritual. First, for Christian de Chergé, dialogue is rooted in experience in context, an action that feeds his own spirituality and faith. For Christian de Chergé, as a soldier first and as a monk after, this experience was lived mainly in 2 difficult contexts. During the colonial period, as a soldier, and during the Algerian Civil War, as a monk. 2 meetings, 2 situations had a deep impact on him. As a soldier, the first and decisive was the met with his friend Muhammad, the farmer who died to save his life. Christian de Chergé wrote about him. In the blood of the friend, I knew my call to follow the Christ should be lived to find, sooner or later, in the same country where I was given this greatest pledge of love. The second example of an experience of dialogue in context is related when he was a monk. In 1975, when he prays in a chapel, a Muslim joins him and said, "Pray for me." And they begin to pray together. He wrote at that event, "These 3 hours made me live what my faith knew possible forever and ever." 1 year after, during his vows, he said that that it was a dream. It was not a dream, but a fact, and in some way the confirmation of his vows. For Christian de Chargé, dialogue is also spiritual. Dialogue, this is not an activity, a space to discuss. It is an interior journey, a deep spiritual attitude to him, and therefore the dialogue does not consist of a theological discussions. He hates these games, sterile and bounded for him. Excuse me, maybe the better way to understand what dialogues mean for him is to use his own metaphor to define it. He wrote, "This is a mystical letter, which consists of 2 posts that are our time. Christian faith and Muslim faith. This letter is planted, laid in earth. Between the 2 posts, there are levels which are supported in both posts. These levels are not what we believe. They are not common beliefs. They are the gift of self to the absolute. Prayer, fasting, sharing, charity, conversion, hospitality, pilgrimage, jihad. They are made to be mounted, not to be counted. This ladder is also supported on the top by the one God, in the communion of saints in the heavenly Jerusalem, where we come from. Dialogue is deeply mystical. A spiritual dialogue is to climb the ladder. But for Christian, spiritual dialogue have conditions. First, humility. God calls us to humility. It means we are to renounce the claim to be better or superior. Second condition, the face of the other is to be considerate. This requires respect for the face of the other, for the faith of the other. A delicacy in its approach, because the face of others is a gift from God for him. And the face of others, and the faith of others, is a gift from God for me. The third condition, the dialogue is not done to make comparisons, but I need the other to look at the signs that will enable me to understand the mystery of God. Unfortunately, this brief presentation does not do justice to the complex and deep thoughts of man who dedicate his life to the interreligious dialogue. His life, his writing, his action in Algeria are all signs of his devotion to Christ and his great faith in the transcendental origin of dialogue, as described in the letter Ecclesiam Suam. I just hope this presentation will offer some inspiration to others to read Christian de Chargé. I won't finish it without give you an extract of a sample. Say that of the last letter of Christian de Chargé. Just read a few lines. For me, Algeria and Islam are something different. They are a body and a soul. I have proclaimed this often enough. I believe in the sure knowledge of what I have received from it, finding there so often that true strength of the gospel. Learned at my mother's knee, my very first church. Already in Algeria itself, in the respect of believing Muslims, my death clearly will appear to justify those who hastily judge me naive or idealistic. Let him tell us now what he thinks of it. But these people must realize that my avid curiosity will then be satisfied. This is what I shall be able to do if God wills, inshallah. Immerse my gaze in that of the Father and contemplate with him his children of Islam just as he sees them, all shining with the glory of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Larry Sullivan. I'm really honored and privileged to be here. Such great colleagues, and those I see in the audience too, who are long part of an exchange between Islam and Christianity. I've always been a listener at the door. I'm not a specialist in Islamic studies, but I've been very fortunate to listen in, as I say, and also to have some good teachers along the way. And I remember I was at University of Chicago studying comparative religions, minding my own business, looking at tribal religions in Central Africa, but took courses in Islam from Fazlur Rahman, who was an extraordinary person. I thought even of speaking about him today. But he said, you know, you comparatives in history of religions, you're always interested in extravagant things. You go looking for these exceptional mystics and people who fly through the air. And so there's no doubt they're interesting. He said, but really, he said, if you want to understand Islam, please, we're a community. We have law, we have behavior, we have ethics, we have ways in which we try to embody and live on the scale of lived communities, ways of acting. He said, you Catholics should understand that. You have your own systems of organization, and so we have interesting things to say to one another. That was a great lesson that kind of stuck in my ear, and the invitation to come and talk about practical holiness really struck me. I think I'm going to probably stay on the practical side. And I do want to just speak about someone whom I came to admire tremendously and came to meet quite by accident, but then had several occasions to meet him. And I thought that he embodied, in a perfectly imperfect way, the definition of practical holiness, or one way of talking about it that you mentioned, that John Paul speaks of, heroism in pursuit of the good. So I want to talk about Abdurrahman Wahid Gusdur, who was the first democratically elected president of Indonesia. And let me say right away, because I'm going to say nice things about him, I'm perfectly aware that he was an imperfect person. And in fact, that's some of my attraction to him. I feel a certain affinity with him in that imperfection. And in fact, I think he represents the trials of modernity, that all of us are so plagued by so many things and possibilities, and yet we feel like we have weights on our legs. You know, I want to be a good scholar, but then I'm in a university, and all of us in universities know that universities weigh on us with the administrative load and the fractiousness and all that's part of our life. He wanted to be a good Muslim and be devout and be studious and a scholar, and yet life, especially in Indonesia under a military regime, weighed on him, and the poverty of his neighbors weighed on him. And he wanted to be a good family man, and yet all of these other public obligations, you know, took him away from that. So I sort of identify with the challenges in his life. And so what I want to point to is the practical holiness, a man who was somehow able to keep a spiritual center to return to sometimes, because we stray, come back to it. So maybe I'll say something about how I accidentally met Gus Dur was his nickname. Gus from Bahasa Bagus, meaning a handsome man. The way you'd say to a kid, "Hey, handsome," and it's kind of a nickname for the son of a Kiai, the son of a leader of a religious school. So, and Dur being a contraction of Abdur Rahman, Dur in the middle. So, sort of brother Gus, if you want, a brother Dur. I was one time, I spent some time at Harvard in an international center. We had some relationships with entities in Indonesia, and so I went to Indonesia to check on our relationships with our partners, and I was guided there by Alwi Shihab, who later on became the foreign minister of Indonesia. A very interesting man, a student of Mahmud Ayyub, actually came to Temple University. Interestingly enough, and it's part of the story, came to Ayyub to study John Courtney Murray and the development of the ideas of religious freedom that were embedded eventually in the Vatican II documents of Nostra Aetate. So, looking at, what's that? Dignitatis Humanae. So he's looking at basically what was the development in the Catholic world of an entity that wanted to deal with the issues of pluralism, religious pluralism, how the state might be receptive to those possibilities, and so on. So Alwi made it possible to go to Indonesia, and during that time it was still the Suharto regime. My wife and I, who's here, she can testify to some of what's going on. We were very nicely brought in by the Religious Affairs Bureau. The Religious Affairs Bureau in Indonesia, you should know, is the largest ministry in the country. There are 100,000 employees in the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And, of course, civil service has its own way of swelling the ranks, let's say. But if you think of it, all the family court law, all education and other issues are handled, inheritance law, all handled through the religious ministry. So it will give you an idea that they're also busy, and they're not just sitting on their hands. Well, some of them are busy. And so we were brought there, and we were very nicely shepherded and treated, and our schedule was very full. And then they would bring us to our hotel at night, and people would wait until we were tucked in, and then they would go away. So we were also carefully watched, I must say, in a military regime. But a number of friends there also made it possible, after the people who were so cordial during the day had tiptoed away to go back to their homes and sleep, then there was an extra knock on the door. And they said, well, now we can also have you meet some other people. And so one of those other people that we were fortunate to meet was Wahid Gusdur, who agreed to meet us in what you could nickname a safe house. It was not his home. It was not anybody else's home. It was someone made available. And he spent the evening with us. This is at a time when meeting with foreigners was both healthy in a sense to keep external relations, but also somewhat of a risk. It was not allowed. And he was really a formidable person. He was a formidable intellect, a formidable human personality. And his reasoning was clearly centered over his religious understanding. Some of the things that you've gone into today, he understood the law of receiving a stranger. I was a stranger. He took me in. And he did in a robust way, letting me know both what Indonesia could promise, where was its place in his view of the Islamic, of the whole Islamic community, what the troubles were that they had to face, and so on. So I want to say, then I had the chance to return to Indonesia even after he was elected president. He was the first democratically elected president. And he received me at they call it the White House also, in the presidential palace. And his tenure was tense. I mean, it would be probably in any administration in any country, but it was particularly tense in Indonesia. A very expansive country, many different factions and ways of looking at matters. He himself was both provocative in many ways and formed alliances and broke them. So in the midst of all that, he consented to meet with me and talk about that. I returned on February 14th when General Wiranto was sent on his way. I don't know if you remember General Wiranto, but he was the general of all of the Indonesian forces, a very powerful man, then later on the head of the Golkar military political party, and a thorn in the side of Indonesian democracy as well as their human rights record in East Timor and so on. So how Wahid managed to put him out of power was a matter of some contest. And I was fortunate or unfortunate to be in Indonesia in the presidential palace on the day that Wiranto was brought in and had to have his interview with Wahid. And the streets were lined with tanks. There was a question of whether, if he was sent on his way, would he go? I mean, after all, you're dealing with a country that had already had a succession of military coups, and he had maybe 3 months before been the military commander of all the forces. As it turned out, Wiranto did go on his way, but Wahid had maneuvered things in certain ways to make sure he didn't really have factions he could join with. I went back another time to Indonesia to a conference in which Mahmoud Ayub was there, and Wahid and Alwi all engaged in intense discussion about the principles of religious freedom and the possibilities of not only Pancasila, which would be an Indonesian policy version of tolerance of multiple religions, but how could it be more deeply grounded, especially in the documents of Vatican II, which I confess they put me to shame knowing about in depth and being able to sort of quote scripture, I could say, to one another about that. Very intense conversation. It was also rather funny. Professor Ayub doesn't see. He's blind. Wahid is also blind. And so it was somewhat embarrassing that they're quoting these texts at great length that they can't read. And I, who read, couldn't really invoke those texts so directly. Wahid played on this, actually, later on when he would be accused of having corruption all around him. He said, "What? I don't see anything." A man of incredible humor in the midst of storms. Just sorry, because his humor was so much a part of him. He came from an area of Indonesia, in Jombang, that's quite famous for proper food according to Muslim diet. And so you find Padang restaurants all throughout Indonesia, no matter where you go, even far from the Padang area. And he claimed that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he found a Padang restaurant. So, at any rate, I want to say a few things about Wahid, to recall some of the decisions in his life, partly just to remind ourselves that practical holiness can be something we can hold fast to or strive for in the midst of the maelstrom of our difficult lives. I find him an admirable person for that reason, and I'm not bringing a strong intellectual argument. He's not a figure I've studied as a scholar, and so I simply bring you my own personal admiration for him and some instances of testimony about him that I think can be admirable. He was from an important lineage, if you can say. His grandfather had founded NU, the Nahdlatul Ulama, a very important religious group that, in the time that I visited him, had 80 million registered people. Think about that for a moment. I mean, that is a formidable force, if you want to think economically, socially and culturally. The powers in Indonesia also understood it was a formidable political force, whether it was formally organized or not. And and on his mother's side, his grandfather had also set up a system of educational schools which encouraged the education of women formally in a way that had not been part of the educational system in Indonesia. So he comes kind of in a lineage, and maybe just to skip along and make the story shorter, he ends up eventually, but as a person in his 40s, faced with the decision to head up this organization or not. He had already waved that possibility off several times, but when his paternal grandfather asked him, well, would you please take up the head of NU? He accepted. I must say, I have the feeling it was reluctantly, even though, of course, it was accession into a certain kind of power. But the man wanted to be a scholar. He wanted to be a person of his family. He wanted to be a person of kind of religious composure and recollection. And a step into that direction also was a formidable obstacle to all those things. Practical holiness. And why did he do that? I think you have to back up a couple of squares. His father died in an auto crash when he was 13. At that point, his mother sent him to a pesantren, a religious boarding school in Yogyakarta. So not East Java, not Jakarta, but in another part of Indonesia. Not that far away, but you could say culturally very important historically for Indonesia. He grew up in an area where Hinduism was part of the golden age of Indonesian identity in Java. But he goes to Yogyakarta, where Buddhism also has a huge footprint. Borobudur is there, the great stupa of the world. And this is all part of his composing his religious horizon, where he sees a richness of the other religiously that he respects and cultivates. So he's brought up in a traditional religious school and boarding house, and he goes there. Later on in his life, sorry, let me just stop along a couple of other places. He eventually is sent to Egypt in Al-Azhar. He studies there. He loves life in Egypt, maybe soccer a lot more than life in the university. But the fact is, his father and grandfather and that particular pesantren had trained him to the classics and to argumentation and also to secular literature in a way that that made Al-Azhar, by contrast, in his own telling of the tale anyway, much more restrictive, in a way he didn't appreciate. So he felt confined there, and he moved toward the more social life in Egypt and also looked for a deepening religious education. So he finished up at Al-Azhar, then he applied and studied in Baghdad. And he studied in Baghdad for 3 years, took his degree from there. And then he applied to Leiden in Holland. Leiden would not recognize his degree from Baghdad. And I must say, for those of you who are scholars from different venues, you realize the woes of these things. You have an intellectual heritage, you know its value and its worth. You go to some other place and they say, well, who are they? And he suffered that fate. So he knocked on the door in the Netherlands for a while. He went to Germany and France for a year. He ended up washing dishes in Germany to just keep himself alive while he looked for a scholarship. Never got it. Looked at McGill in Canada. He came back to Indonesia, joined the student youth movement, wrote for journals, Kompas, for example, very known journal in Indonesia. Very interesting pieces. Again, always this mixture of religious grounds for a social ethic. And for Kompas, he did a tour of Indonesia of the pesantren. So he was looking at that kind of middle school and high school education, but it brought him into all different parts of Indonesia. And what impressed him was the extreme poverty in which people were living in this militarized state. So he began to lobby for transformation of education, for transformation of the government, and also for transformation of NU, his grandfather's strong and large religious organization. So the story gets complicated, and that's part of the virtue I find in this man's life. He was willing to sort of wade through all of the complications of modern life and still keep his compass point, if I can put it that way, to live a life for others. So, for example, he insisted that NU, when he ascended to become their head, he insisted that it detach itself from any political party. So it become a religious party in its own right, independent of any particular political affiliation. Something that defanged, let's say, the power he would assume by becoming the head of that organization. So 80 million people, he brought them out of the political process and freed them to vote for whatever ways they wanted. So that's on one hand, he's looking for reform in NU. On the other hand, he's looking for educational reform at the level of the religious schools, pressing them to step into a more broad conception of education for women, education for a wider range of materials that are being considered, and also for the style of argumentation. He's pressing for that. And on the third hand, he realizes, once the financial crisis hits Indonesia, that Suharto is now vulnerable, and there is a chance for political reform. So he forms a political party and steps away from NU, keeping his own principles, if you want to say. Of course, everybody knows his name in NU, so you can think of it as you wish. He still is a man who brings a lot of constituents, let's say. But he founds PKB, the Political Awakening Party, and he, through machinations that are very interesting but difficult to put together in a short time, he manages to create a set of coalitions, principally with Amin Rais, who is another religious political leader, with Megawati Sukarnoputri, who is the daughter of Sukarno, the first military dictator immediately after the war, the World War II period, and with, I'm blanking on the third person right now. So he's with Wiranto, the military head of the Golkar party. He manages to sort of finesse a number of different alliances, and lo and behold, in 1999, who is the first democratically elected president is Wahid. I want to just point to a couple of things that he did during his short time as president. He was from 1999 to 2001. Maybe start right at the most controversial end, that he proposed establishing full diplomatic relations with Israel. This caused a firestorm. This was not a way to start to consolidate your popularity. But he did a number of interviews, and his argument was this, kind of a religious argument. He said, look, we have relations with China and with the Soviet Union. They're atheists. They're formally atheistic ideologies. Can't we work out some kind of diplomatic relations with Jews who believe in God? So it was not sort of, let's, get over history and so on. It was a religious argument, and it was like right in your nose. Well, and as you can picture, the parliament didn't go that direction. But what he did was he established trade relations. So I'll take what I can get, so to say. He himself joined the Elijah Institute based in Israel, run by Alon Goshen, who is a rabbi who has an interreligious dialogue institute. He signed up and joined as a member of their religious council, which was a really unusual move, let's say, and gained a lot of scrutiny in the Indonesian press. The other thing is that he went and visited Israel, and so he took on himself to actually put himself in that place. He established the Chinese New Year as an official holiday. For those of us outside Indonesia, this is a tricky thing. The Chinese community has its own economic place in the economic ladder of existence, and hasn't always been so well regarded by a vast number of Muslims. When there are certain kinds of setbacks on recessions, the Chinese places and establishments have often been the targets of riots and destruction. He kind of stood for them and said, let's lift that up and make that an official holiday in the calendar of Indonesian celebrations. Just a couple of other points to illustrate sorry, I had made some notes to myself, but I've kind of outrun my legs on where I was. I better catch up on my reading what I had to say. Only that he ended up in the end forming a set of different coalitions with different political parties along the way, and some of them quite surprising coalitions, ones that weren't expected, with the Golkar party, with the military, for example. He both joined with them and then backed away from them. Was considered a kind of unreliable partner in the end because of his ability to join ranks with everyone and then also sever as they came into an issue that he could not agree on. His last trip abroad was on Hajj, interestingly enough. And after that time, he stood election, something like Francis maybe. His own groups began to fracture and splinter. The Franciscans don't go into that part of the history, but things got pretty stormy pretty fast, even in Francis's own lifetime. And so, too, Wahid doesn't preside over some, magnificent unanimity that rides off into the sunset and wears a crown of glory. Maybe like a lot of democracies, it descends into fractiousness and splinter groups, and his own PKB party in his own lifetime became severed into two parts. And then he stood election from the one part, but was not elected by the whole party itself when he came back for standing re-election. So I want to say I admire this very imperfect person. I find him a candidate worthy of looking at for practical holiness, for a man who seemed to me to, we would probably do well to just read through his Friday sermons during Ramadan over several years to see how grounded he wished all this politics and social policy and so on to be in his reading of his own religious life. But I think we can agree that was his primary motivator, something he always acknowledged he received from his family. So this imperfect person who tried to persevere in arriving at a new political solution for his country, at some new dimensions of social justice, and especially for an educational system that might bring people to the same kind of understandings and appreciation of holiness. I'll just close with this one thought. You mentioned Gabriel Marcel, whom I admire on admiration, and Marcel, following a certain French line of thought, I must say, on admiration, wants to say admiration is very akin to love because it begins to make us move off of a life centered on ourselves, already pointed toward the other, admirar, to look toward another person. And Levinas, a more contemporary writer even after Marcel, made the point that this movement toward the other really has already a directionality to it, what he called an axiology of holiness, because it goes toward life or direction toward the wholly other, the completely other, the divine. And Levinas, who's rather a secular person in some regards, brings himself to this language. So I think in the Kiai and Gusdur, we see a person who was very rooted in today's life, in the difficulties of politics and economics in a globalized society, but whose eyes were fixed on this axiology of holiness, and I admire that. So thank you.
So friends, maybe we could give our panelists one round of applause and thanks for all these astonishing presentations. And then we could open the floor for questions and discussion. Yes.
Yeah, also comments or only questions?
So David had his hand up first, and then Dr. Gabriel.
David Gabriel, I taught here all together too long, and I'm a visitor from Mount Gaza College in Nairobi. I want to thank the organizers of this because I would like to draw these disparate talks together to make a point about the importance of interfaith discussion for theologians. And that is beginning with a Ibn Hazm, Cordova, Andalusia, but Cordova. And the significance of the citation of Ibn Hazm in the discourse, that Regensburg discourse, of course, came from a wonderful French Islamicist. I'm doing some Silsala here, that is how people get connected with other people. A wonderful French Islamicist, Rashied, a dear friend, whose book, Three Messengers for One God, we translated here some years ago. And also then, Gabriel's rehabilitation, as it were, of Ibn Taymiyyah. It's important to remember that Tom Michel has been one of the most significant interlocutors for Christianity and Islam in our time. Did his dissertation with Fazl Rahman on Ibn Taymiyyah. So these people come together to help animate it. Rasoul's discussion of Francis of Assisi follows also that of Christian de Chergé, and in some respects what Larry was saying about Wahid. Namely, when we try to understand what interfaith experience and learning, Brad's thing, mutual illumination, happens to us, it is that we were always looking at the underside. We're subverting the dominant picture, which for centuries was Christendom on the one side and Islamic hate on the other side. And that's where there was no dialogue because power groups were meeting each other. And it's only recently that we have become liberated from that. And I was going to ask that you distribute that thing. Thanks. Get some help. Do it more quickly with some help. Okay. Because what's happened most recently in this regard is Al-Azhar has come up with a statement on religious freedom which mirrors, in fact, Dignitatis Humanae in Vatican II. And offers not just the fact that we can have churches in Muslim countries, but that Muslims themselves, if they feel drawn to it, can adopt another religious conviction. Now that is a very strong movement out of a particular mindset in which Islam was, as a result, of course, of being a cohesive community which had power. So some very important things are happening, that are always happening underneath. They people who are subverting the dominant picture. And that's an important thing to understand in Notre Dame, because Notre Dame is always concerned with the dominant picture. And that if we can subvert this in our inquiry, then we're discovering something about the kingdom of God as it breaks through in different things. So I think all 5 of these presentations were so excellent because they illustrated a way in which interfaith dialogue and understanding can enrich the theology of the periodic.
Thank you. Dr. Cavadini, stand up.
Yes. Do I have to stand up?
As good as you can.
As I wish. Okay.
Please stand up, otherwise we can't hear you.
Okay. I will stand up. Good.
Come on.
Very short comments regarding this Al-Azhar statements. I think it's just one verse of Quran which says, فَبَشِّرْ عِبَادَ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ. This is clearly stated in Quran that we have to be open towards all different opinions and convictions. We have to listen to all different, sayings and follow the best one of them. How we have not noticed it, how we have not practiced it in the past years, or perfectly practiced it, it is another story. Then on Larry's deliberations, I think it was so good that we hear the story of someone who is so close to us, who is a living person, a tangible figure. And in that sense, I wish my good friend Dr. Rasoulipur, he would have presented a Christian which is more tangible. Francis or Francois d'Assisi, he is so remote. He is so remote. He is a saint. He's such a great mystical personality, but it is very difficult to become a Francois Assisi, almost impossible. But it is possible to become either, Gordur or Wahid Abdurrahman. One example I see in Christian world is the lady which I mentioned yesterday, the great lady scholar Anne-Marie Schimmel. Schimmel, you said Francois or Francis Assisi, he had lived with the Muslims and he had developed some new intuitions and all that. Anne-Marie Schimmel goes to the Islamic world. I don't know if you know it or not, but Schimmel could speak all the important Islamic languages: Turkish, Arabic, Farsi, Urdu. And when she used to come to Iran, she talked in Persian with us. When she went to Turkey, she talked, and she was excellent in Turkish. I have Turkish friends which have told me that they learned, Turkish grammar from Anne-Marie Schimmel. She was brilliant in learning different languages. And when she had lived in the Islamic countries, she had come so close and she had understood. And that's why her books are so interesting for us. She has written, one of the last books is that, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. It starts with in German, and Muhammad is. That means that yes, Jesus is the prophet of God, Moses is the prophet of God, but let us not forget that Muhammad is also a prophet of God. This comes, in the light of these new movements that people want to say, Prophet Muhammad was not a prophet, he was imitating, what was written in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But anyhow, Anne-Marie Schimmel is if you say to a lady scholar who is sitting in the room, try to become an Anne-Marie Schimmel, this is not unachievable. Okay, you can try probably you can achieve those goals. But if you say someone becomes Francis Assisi, it's difficult. Then on Gabriel paper, two small points. He was, Ibn Taymiyyah was a man of conviction and he believed in what he said. But is that really always good? What if what you say is not correct? What if your own impression from the tradition you belong to is not a good interpretation, a good understanding? Let me give you an example on the Islamic side. You know, these guys who committed this tragic, incident of 9/11. Okay, some of them, they are reading Quran and all that. If one of them stays with his convictions, says, yeah, okay, if I have given I a chance, I would also attack again. This is, you always have to double check your faith vis-a-vis your model, your prototype. The Christians, they have to always check themselves vis-a-vis Jesus the Christ. We have to check ourselves always vis-a-vis our Prophet Muhammad. And in fact, there is a tradition, Hadith Qudsi in Islam, which says the Archangel Gabriel, or what we call Gabriel, used to come to our Prophet twice a year. And he used to double check the belief of our Prophet, not if something is forgotten or not if something is mistaken. You know, Ibn Taymiyyah, okay, he believed, but let me give you only one observation. Based on Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwas, tens of thousands of Muslims have been killed since his day. Tens of thousands. For one reason, he is so famous in the Islamic world. He did not believe in making pilgrimage to the holy sites. You know, you Christians have holy sites and you make pilgrimage to it. We do the same thing, especially the Muslims we have in the city of Najaf and all that. Ibn Taymiyyah said, okay, no pilgrimage, no holy site, no building and no shrines. And if he wanted, if he could, to also destroy the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad, but that was too much for him. Otherwise, he ordered his followers to destroy, holy cities like, Karbala and Najaf and the shrine of the Shiite Imams and all that. I think, okay, he was a man of conviction. Up to the last day in prison, he stayed with what he believed. But, okay, you have to double check your beliefs with someone, with a model. And in my opinion, Ibn Taymiyyah is not a very, very good, example of a very devout Muslim. And maybe if next time I am in Notre Dame, I will present a paper that how much different his opinions in many areas, how much different his fatwas were from the genuine teachings of Prophet Muhammad. Thank you.
I'll bring you down to the boxing room. Maybe you could identify yourself for everyone, just in case.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to do it.
No, I don't mean you. I already did, but I don't know everybody.
My name is Colin Bagaforo from the Philippines. I come from Mindanao in the Philippines. My work is always in the midst of Muslims almost every day. I have a comment and I have a question. I was struck by the statement of Ustad Rashied when he said that dialogue, interreligious dialogue starts, especially when you eat together, when you sit together, when you drink together. Because in the Philippines, in Mindanao, we have what we call the Bishops' Ulama Conference. And that is a gathering of bishops and ulama in Mindanao, where we meet together 4 or 5 times in a year. When I was new in the Bishops' Ulama Conference, that was in 2008, I asked the head of the Bishops' Ulama Conference, his name is Archbishop Fernando Capalla. He was the Archbishop of Davao City, one of the big cities in Mindanao. And I asked him, together with the other bishops, we asked him, when shall we start dialogue with the ulama? And his answer was very simple. And he said, we are already starting the dialogue. Because what we notice is, whenever we meet, we usually start in the afternoon, and we discuss on one burning issues in Mindanao, like the peace negotiation between the insurgents group in Mindanao. We call them at this time we call them the MILF, the More Islamic Liberation Front. And after around 2 or 3 hours of talking about that burning issue, the rest of the afternoon and until the wee hours in the night, we will all just be eating and talking with one another, and we call that one Solidarity Night. And the bishop said, friendship is the beginning of interreligious dialogue. And I agree with you, Ustad Rashied, with that comment that you made. My question is, I go to my questions. I have 2 questions. But if you do not like to answer the first one, it's all right. We go to the first or the second one. The first question is, in your interreligious experiences for many years, I'm just curious. I would like to know what are, if you can cite 1 or 2 difficulties that you have encountered with interreligious dialogue with the Catholic Church, with Christians. And second would be, there are mention about fatwa. One Islamic leader would issue a fatwa. Osama bin Laden, when he was alive, he would issue a fatwa. Another great Islamic leader will also issue another fatwa. My question is, and I'm doing it now, I'm doing some research, and I do not find it yet, whether are there occasions where intra dialogue is being done among the Muslims? Well, in the Christian faith, that's the most difficult one. The intra, inter is okay, but intra, like Episcopalian and the other churches in the Christian world, so that's the thorny part. And in my readings now, in my research, I'm trying to find out whether or not there are instances where there are intra-dialogue being done. Well, there are 2 groups that you said, the Sunni and the Shiites. But other than that, are there any? Thank you very much. Oh yeah, to Professor Rasoulipour.
Thank you for those. I think those are really tough but wonderful questions. I think that this is exactly what I think we have had interreligious dialogue for a long time now. And I think I usually say that we have to go to these difficult questions. I put it in this way. Interreligious dialogue has matured now, and we need to go beyond. And this is my eating metaphor. Cucumber sandwiches and samosas. Just eating together and being nice and patting each other on the back, because there are very difficult issues. Let me start with the question of intra-religious dialogue. I think that is absolutely essential. Ecumenical dialogue, as you would call it in Christianity. I think there's a huge absence of that. I mean, just the illustration that we had here of different appreciations of Ibn Taymiyyah is an example of that. With all great figures, there are always, in our age, different appropriations of St. Francis of Assisi, or of Al-Ghazali, or of Ibn Hazm. All great, because they're so rich, they produce so many wonderful And so we appropriate them and we mold them in our own image. And that dialogue needs to take place. There's been a wonderful, new book on Ibn Taymiyyah by Yahya Mishort. Is it Mishort? I think he's at Hartford Seminary, which is, because the Salafi Wahhabis have appropriated Ibn Taymiyyah, molded him in their image, but there are also other Ibn Taymiyyahs. And I'm not saying that he's not problematic. I think that, as Larry Sullivan was saying, I believe that we are frail human beings, and imperfect as we are, we also have many great things that we can bring. So if we're searching for the perfect human being who cannot have any contradictions, I think that is romanticizing the past. So the point is, the intra-religious dialogue is completely absent. The closest thing that came recently, which was inspiring, but it's one meeting, what happened in Jordan, where they had two documents, the one Kalimatun Sawa, in response to Regensburg, but another one, the intra-religious dialogue, in which I'm not sure, you can find it online, what it's exactly called, where they affirmed that, we should not have kind of this takfir, excommunication of Shiites. So what's it called? The Amman message. Risala to Amman. I think this is the most, very inspirational to me, but we haven't taken it further. We need that dialogue. It's absolutely essential. And that, I think, is part of the crisis of Muslims, that we don't have the tolerance for each other. Even different groups. I mean, as much as I, dislike, the Salafi Wahhabis or Bin Laden, it is not good enough for us to say that, he's not a Muslim. He may be more sincere than, than I am. He might be sincerely misguided from my point of view. But he's quoting exactly the same texts from the Quran that I and every other Muslim believes in. It grates on my ears when I hear his messages, because he's not reciting another Quran. So we need to look at, and he's invoking classical Muslim scholars. So we are not going to get out of the bind by just, saying, well, he's not a Muslim. Because there are others, we need to see how he's interpreting those texts and deal with that. So this is the first point. The second point with regard to difficulty, there are many difficulties, of course, in our relationship with each other, and it will take a long time to resolve it. And we must also not be idealistic to think that we will reach some kind of paradise on earth. Differences are healthy, and we need to persevere with that. But the two most important ones is, I think, the question of what I've called proselytization, especially evangelical Christians, being very overeager in Africa and elsewhere in saving souls. They're pushing large amounts of money in this effort. And unfortunately, on the Muslim side, and David, I think that maybe you're being too generous to Al-Azhar and the Muslims. But, in this document, I've just briefly looked at it. It's exactly the same thing that they're saying. They're saying there is freedom of religion. But there's no specifically saying freedom to change your religion. That's the word you have to look for, which means a Muslim, who no longer feels in his heart to embrace Islam, but wants to be a Christian. Can that person be able to flourish within a Muslim society? I am not sure this is what Al-Azhar is saying.
You are right, Rashied.
This is called irtidad, ridda. And this is a major problem among Muslims. And we need to resolve that, and we need to be honest about that. So I have written a paper about, to put this dialogue. On the Christian side, how can we have the ethics of mission? We can't take da'wah and mission out. We have to witness to our faith. But how can we do it in a way which does not do violence to the integrity of the other? And on the Muslim side, how can we deal, frankly and honestly, with the question of apostasy, as we call it? Right? That's the other more difficult problem, is the problem of violence. But not the problem of Muslim violence. I think this is well known. Everyone knows that we have crazies in our midst. But the way in which Western Christianity is legitimating state violence. Sure. Right? And all forms of violence, but they are not speaking about, when the state commits violence, it is not violence. It's called legitimate force. And that's why liberation theology is a problem in Latin America, because the church is aligned to all of these dictators. And that's the problem with Al-Azhar and Sheikh Ahmad al-Tayyib. Why don't we Muslims listen to our authorities? Because all of them are in cahoots with the regimes. Ahmad al-Tayyib was al-Mubarak, he was serving in that particular, who was going to listen to him when the masses are suffering? And the problem with the church is if we say, look at what's happening in the Muslim world. No Muslim is supporting Saudi Arabia or any of those regimes. You are not speaking on behalf of the Muslims. You are speaking about the authorities whom we ourselves are suffering under. So it's very important that the church also changes its position. Instead of colluding with power, it should look at the global injustices in the world. And if there is this, peacelessness in the Muslim world, it is good, because we are challenging the global injustices, the huge disparities of wealth. And it's not unique to Muslims. You go to Latin America, among Catholics struggling there, and that is why this kind of saints that we need is that of Oscar Romero, who will resonate in the Muslim world. And that's not to justify the kind of terrorist violence that are being perpetrated by crazies, but this is the way in which we can have a prophetic voice to heal our world.
Thank you very much.
Friends, we have time for one more question. I think you had your hand up, maybe very quickly after.
No, it's okay. I'll wait till later.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Munir. I come from far away from Chicago, so I have to ask something. Although my question might not be significant. I guess my question is for Professor Rashied and Sheikh Gabriel. Professor Rashied, you began your excellent talk by illuminating two major tendencies within modern Islam, Sufi and Salafi tendencies. And I think my question is about your choice of Ibn Hazm. Are you suggesting a connection between Salafi views of Tahrir or the charge of the falsification with Ibn Hazm? Because my study of modern Muslim scholars, including those who call themselves Salafis, seem to suggest no clear connection. Instead, they refer to Ibn Taymiyyah, which is understandable because Ibn Taymiyyah is one of the primary sources of inspiration for the Salafis. As we know well that Ibn Taymiyyah viewed the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible, in more positive light. And I think Professor Gabriel can talk a lot about this. And even in his epistle to the leaders, the leader of Cyprus, called Risala Kubrusiyya, he called Christian as Ahlul Tawheed, which is the people of monotheism, which is significant, keeping in mind the contentious issues of the doctrine of Trinity among Muslims. So, Professor Gabriel, as regard to the hellfire punishment, I think recent studies show that the views of Ibn Taymiyyah is not unique. Recent study by Muhammad Khalil, he wrote dissertation on Muslim discussion of salvation of the others by examining 5 scholars, including Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, and the modern scholar like Rashied, seem to suggest that the view of non-eternality of hell punishment is more prevalent than what is sometimes supposed.
So thank you so much. And my answer will be brief, mainly because I don't have much useful to say. I think I can just sort of reflect on the interest of me in Ibn Taymiyyah's, the particular affirmation by Ibn Taymiyyah of this point, because it seems to be a way of illuminating this contrast between the way he's been appropriated, as Dr. Omar was saying, in the contemporary context. Indeed, he's somehow, for Salafis, become simply a reflection, a mirror of any doctrine that they wish to promulgate. And so isn't it sort of exciting to discover this, in this particular doctrine, and there are others, Dr. Gavahi is 100% right. There are other doctrines, especially as a Christian, by the way. His first fatwa was, or at least famous public fatwa, was for the execution of a Christian who had been accused of insulting the Prophet and then converted to Islam to save himself. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, we can't trust this conversion. So, but isn't it interesting on this one particular point? It sort of is a way, I suppose, of undermining the adaptation or the adoption, rather, of the Salafis of Ibn Taymiyyah. Just in regard to Ibn Hazm, and then I'll be done. It's important, of course, to remember that Ibn Hazm comes from a particular, as you know very well, Munim, a particular Sunni legal school that disappeared subsequently. So it would be maybe less useful for contemporary figures to adopt him, maybe.
So friends, 10 of 12, so we're a little bit over time. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists once again for these presentations will be available on the Institute for Church Life website in about a week, along with the talks from last night. Friends, we will reconvene at 3:30 in 126 de Barlow to join with the Theology Department World Religion and World Church Colloquium, which will be presented by Father Samir, the classical Arab Christian presentation of the faith in the Islamic milieu. 3:30, 126 de Barlow. Thanks, everybody.